also going to begin our recording. One of the most common questions I always get from people for our webinars is, will this be recorded and can I access it later? So I'll just tell you up front, in case you have to leave early, that yes, I will send out an email tomorrow morning that has a link to this recording on YouTube and also resources that the presenters share with you tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and mute and let Danielle take over.
The first time I've heard that. Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you. Today, I am kicking things off with a nice discussion about forests and climate change. And hopefully you'll leave with some ideas on how you can manage your woods to help cope with climate change as well. Okay, so for those of you who might not know me, I work for an organization called the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And we're located all over the place, but I am actually located up in Houghton, Michigan, way up in the UP. And the work that we do is really focused on providing practical information and resources and technical assistance related to forests and climate change. So really the focus of the work that I'm doing today is a big bulk of the work that I do all over 20 states. We do climate adaptation work, but also, carbon work and modeling. And our whole institute is actually, funded by several different sources from the Forest Service, different academic institutions, including the University of Minnesota and others, but also Indigenous perspectives are integrated into the work that we do through the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and as well as forest industry through the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement. So if you want to learn more about our group, head over to our website at niax.org. Okay, so that was just a preamble. Hey, I'm going to talk at you, but now I'm giving you an invitation to join me. We're going to do 3 quick activities throughout my presentation just to keep it lively because it's the evening and I don't want you to fall asleep. So right now, if you could head over to menti.com, and when you get there, copy over these numbers that are in yellow, 71, 27, 03, 51. Or you can just open your smartphone on the camera setting and just sort of hover over this QR code and it'll take you there. It's like technology worked. Okay, so when you get there, I know you're getting there. I'm going to make sure you get there, but this is just a preamble. So as you get there, what we're going to do is, the focus of my talk and all the talks today is really to talk about forests and watersheds, right? And we know that a key component of healthy watersheds is a forest because forests have so many roles in our forests that help to provide clean water. They, reduce the impacts of flooding. They can extend stream flow. They can prevent erosion, provide wildlife habitat, and even create clean water, right? So we know globally why forests are so important, but a big part of our discussion tonight is learning about you. Why do you love your woods? Why are forests important to you? So if you have made it to Menti, I will know because I will see you come into this room. And I'm willing to wait. Got to get a few folks in here. And this is just a fun thing to do because I just want to mix it up rather than having presentation in the evening that could make you fall asleep after dinner. I thought I would have a little activity. So let's see if somebody can join me. Got some nice responses. Couple of folks. Adventures with my dog. Peaceful. Wildlife. Good smells. That is a great one. I love that. Relaxing. Ooh, color, especially this time of year. Fresh air. Ooh, adventure seems to be a big one. Good vibes. I would lump that with relaxing. Magic. Ooh, I like that one. Diversity, feeling refreshed, hiking, fall colors, conservation. There's some nerds in the room. I love it. All right, scenic. Looks like people less. Come to the UP. I will show you a land where there are very few people. Okay, great. Well, now that I got you engaged, I feel like I'm really getting to know you. You guys go to the woods because you love the woods, right? There's some connectivity between how you live and being in the woods. It's a pressure relief valve. It's just a nice opportunity to let it all go. And we all have different values for the woods and different reasons why we care about our woods. Okay, so now we'll jump back into our presentation. I'm also here to talk about climate change. So I'm here to talk about forests and climate change. And one thing I want to point out is, perhaps you've already experienced, or noticed that things are changing. So looking at past observations, looking at those weather stations, we have an idea of how much temperature and precipitation have changed over time. And all of these dots indicate statistically important. So like huge shifts since 1950 to 2019, we are seeing that most of Minnesota has increased by at least 3 degrees. That's pretty huge, right? Now, when we look at precipitation, we see that average annual precipitation has kind of dramatically changed across the state of Minnesota, broadly with the southern region experiencing 20% increase in precipitation annually, and less, as you move northward to the Arrowhead, 5 to 10%. Overall, it is getting wetter. So when we go back to our forest and we really, put yourself back into your forest, you probably have a vision for, what that forest is. And maybe the vision is that it'll stay the same. It'll carry on the same values, right? But a changing climate really introduces this additional uncertainty. And in some cases, it can completely change and alter our forests in a big way. And the ways in which climate change will impact our forests are not fully understood, right? Because we don't have a crystal ball to completely understand where we're going. We know that our woods are already facing, so many different maybe risks, and they are also experiencing this changing climate. We know that a changing climate will intensify anything that it's already experiencing, like pest issues, invasive species issues, and that can have a huge impact on the watersheds that we care about, altering the condition, the quality of our ecosystems, wildlife habitat, water quality that we depend on, water quantity, how much water we're getting, and the infrastructure that we need to get in and out of our communities. And, if we were to really look through the list of all of the different effects that a warming climate can have on our watershed, it's an extensive list. And you might see some stressors that you're already experiencing or things you've already observed, like a longer growing season. These are things that will continue to happen in a greater intensity down the road. So, these will have consequent effects on our watershed as well, degrading water quality, fluctuating stream flow, and maybe reducing aquatic habitat. But what does this mean for forests and ecosystems? We know that climate change will have an effect all over, but not all lands will be affected in the same way, meaning some forests, some ecosystems, and tree species may be more or less vulnerable to the threats of climate change. And one way to think about this is to think about, plants themselves. We know as the climate warms, this will change the tolerances of some species that are more of those northern boreal species, and they will want to move more northward, seeking that cooler environment, which will then open up some opportunities from southerly species that are starting to march forward into the northern extent of their range as well. So, we're very likely going to see this new mixing happen where, species will start seeking the northern part of their range, and that may introduce some new species uncommon to our area at this time. So that's kind of conceptual, but since we don't have a crystal ball and we can't tell the future, we can use models to visualize how habitats may change under different climate warming scenarios. And we like to look at the end of century. This model is the U.S. Forest Service's tree atlas model and tool, and we use this to help us understand where tree habitat may shift on the landscape due to that climate-induced warming and altered precipitation. So as I'm showing here, the very important habitat, that dark blue and dark green area predicted for quaking aspen, is expected to be reduced in all warming scenarios, right? But as the warming gets warmer, the scenario on the bottom, we're seeing that the best habitat for quaking aspen really shrinks. And you can go to the climate change tree atlas tool website to look at different species that you care about as well. Now I have pulled together a list of species that are relevant to northern Minnesota here and sort of lumped them into the outputs of that from that model. And what you can see is that some trees are likely to gain suitable habitat in a more warming climate, even more warming than we've already experienced, while others may actually lose suitable habitat. And we saw that with quaking aspen. This list describes species that may have better habitat suitability, species that can cope with those changes, and then species that cannot. And all of these are pulled from a forest ecosystem vulnerability assessment, something that you can read additionally if you go to our website on the bottom of the screen, forestadaptation.org/Northwoods. It's important to note that although some tree species are expected to expand, right, to move into this area, that expansion of range is really constrained by many factors like landscape fragmentation that affects seed dispersal and regeneration. So that actual expansion might take a much longer time, and there could be a lag before that niche is filled in the landscape. So you might be asking, how will all this play out on my land? Well, that depends, right? So again, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't foresee the future, but we can use our local knowledge about our land and our own expertise to provide some clues and context into how, climate change may play out on our landscape. So if your land is already prone to flooding, where the water settles, you may want to think about that when you're thinking about your land in the context of more precipitation. Similarly, if your land experiences severe drought in a really crispy way, then you might be thinking about the plants that live in that very crispy side of your land when we have experienced longer growing seasons and much warmer elevated summer temperatures. So wrapping this part up, it's all to say that looking into the future, our forests will change, but probably not because of one stressor. It's very likely that our forests will change, not because of just one extreme event like a flood or a wind event, but due to that cumulative effect of stresses over time. So, we know that our forests, our woods are already under stress from other causes of climate change. It could be deer browse, invasive species, past land history, and climate change really is only going to exacerbate those underlying stresses and make those forests harder to persist and give them a more challenging obstacle to overcome. So getting back to the activity, hopefully you're still on this website and I haven't lost you. I want to hear from you. What climate-related impacts will have the greatest effect on your land? So when you're thinking about your place, you're thinking about the slope, the position, the soils, the experiences that you have on the landscape. How concerning are any of these climate change impacts? So go to this website, menti.com, use the code 71270351 up at the top of the screen here. You can copy this link and even put it into the chat. And toggle this screen, move them back and forth and just give me an idea here. Right, so for some folks, there's one person in particular, very worried about extreme heat, warmer temperatures, increased frequency of drought. It's good to prioritize. We say you should prioritize at least like your top 3. Keep those in the top of your mind when you're walking your land. Really start to think about where the ridges are, where those undulations are, where water naturally settles in the spring, and keep that in mind when you start to experience these, more frequent heavy precipitation events. Get things out of the way. Let's see, changes in habitat suitability for vegetation, changes in invasive species. Let's get like 2 more before we get going here. Great. Oof, it's hard to tell which one's gonna win. This is like my favorite part of using this tool. Is it fewer cold days? Is it changes in habitat? Is it changes in invasive species? Well, what we can see from all of this is that we're all on the same page here. So we are all extremely concerned about several of these climate change impacts. And, I would say, we're all in alignment, thinking back about how winters used to be, thinking about how they are now, and imagining what that might mean for the rest of the year's water supply and that the effects it may have on habitat suitability. I'm sure you're doing your own mental calculation as well. Okay, so it was a Those activities were a little bit of a teaser to get you interested to read about this yourself. And I don't want you to go and read a 200-page vulnerability assessment unless you would like to. But I would like you to read this 14-page, like little quick guide where we've distilled these big topics, how climate change will affect forests, and given you a nice little primer, something that you can use as you're walking around your property, have on your phone, and start thinking about from each of the trees that are on your land. How vulnerable are they? What are some of those major stressors at your site that could, increase risk or even decrease risk? So if you go to forestadaptation.org/Northwoods, I'll put that link in the chat in a minute, you can find this really great resource written for you in Minnesota. Okay, but I don't want to leave you hanging just like feeling like you're out on a limb. Oh gosh, well now I'm thinking about this Debbie Downer stuff. I want to give you a hint at some things that you can actually do about it. So what can we do about it? Well, we have options. And the big option is called adapting. It's adaptation. It's taking actual steps, actions on the ground that can help our ecosystem adjust and prepare for these changes in climate. And so, what we're trying to do is meet our values so that we can keep this land, a forest, and providing these values into the future. Now we have different ways of doing this. We can take actions that can help to reduce those impacts of flooding and drought, and that's called resistance, to help improve the defenses of the forest, all the way to taking very proactive steps to intentionally facilitate change and enable that ecosystem to respond to changing conditions. So we have lots of options. There is a continuum. You don't have to just do resilience. You can do resistance, resilience, or transition. There's lots of places in between. But the take-home message here is that we're all going to do something different because the actions that we design, customized for our woods, are based on you. They're based on your goals, your values, and the purpose of what you're trying to do on that land. So there is no single solution to adapting to climate change in our woods. There is no easy button, but we are free to make our own decisions and to create customized adaptation actions that suit our forests, our woods, and our goals. So last activity, what can you do? So I put a starter list of ideas on here. You can imagine there's an infinite number of ways that you could help your forest adapt to climate change based on your property, based on your goals, and your location, your geography. But here's a couple ideas. And so mull this over, and you can vote a couple of times. But let me know, which one of these actions sort of feels like something you might do. Something practical. Plant native trees adapted to future conditions that are also well suited to the property. Maybe you want to take steps to address forest pests and invasive species proactively. Maybe you want to take steps to increase diversity of trees and understory species, sort of hedge your bets. Make sure that it's not just a monoculture of trees out in that landscape, but you've got a good variety in case one gets struck by, a pest or pathogen. You've got others that can help fill that niche. If you live in a city or you have, a very dry, maybe you have an orchard or you have something like a really dry situation, you may want to consider watering in that late summer period where we go with longer periods without rain, or even mulching trees that are really important to you. We could all do something about deer one way or another. The season is upon us. And we could do what we can to identify those understory species and get to know our woods, and then seek out actions that can protect rare and unique species. Keep them on the landscape. Give them a little home where they'll definitely survive. But probably most important and relevant to the rest of our talks today is maybe we could keep forests as forests and learn about conservation easements, and contact a local forester to learn more about land planning. It looks like most of you have chosen really proactive ideas. You can go to your tree sale at your conservation district and say, I want trees that can cope with drier conditions. I want trees that can cope with longer periods of moisture. These are the questions that you could be proactively asking for. Trees that are adapted to those future conditions that can help increase the diversity of your site. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with these resources just as a reminder. If you head on over to forestadaptation.org/Northwoods, it's kind of our collection for all resources in Minnesota. So you'll find tree species lists, this cool guide, some videos, lots of really great stuff there. If you want to sit down with this information and start walking around your woods, you could use this Minnesota Woods Health Scorecard that really, it's on 8.5 by 11 size paper, and you can start walking around your woods and checking the boxes and starting to understand, how healthy are my woods and what actions might I take to, increase that resiliency of the woods and retain those long-term benefits over time. This was created within a great collaboration with the University of Minnesota, my group, NIAX, the American Forest Foundation, and the Nature Conservancy. So vetted by some really great folks. It's about 6 pages long. And finally, if you want to see how other people are thinking about climate adaptation in the real world, I would invite you to go to our website again, forestadaptation.org/demos, and click on any of the dots on the homepage, and it'll bring you to a case study. We've got almost like 200 case studies online, over 500 examples in our own library as well. And they're just fabulous ways for you to sort of contextualize what this might look like on your property as well. And finally, just, my contact information, please reach out to me and do what you can to start, wrapping your brain around this topic and starting to prioritize actions that you can take on your land. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. Before we move on to our next presenters, are there any questions from participants? Anybody want to unmute to ask a question or type a question in the chat box?
Hi, this is Peter.
Hi.
On our property, we have a lot of white pine. What's a good time to start bud capping those?
That is a great question. Can I get back to you? Because I'll send it. I can send a note to Angie and she can pass it on to you. But I would think now, or like so that you can before the spring. But I can look that up for you.
Yeah, I can post it if you give me the info, or I can put it in the chat for everyone in a little bit.
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, well, we will go ahead and move on to our next presenter then, who is Tara Kelly from the Washington Conservation District. And for those of you who are local to Washington County or the Twin Cities metro area, Tara will be able to provide a little bit more of a local perspective on some of the issues and programs that we have right here in our area. And it looks like Tara's ready to go. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Tara.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yes, okay, great. Well, that was a really great introduction and framework to this concept. And once again, my name is Tara Kelly. I'm a landscape restoration specialist with the Washington Conservation District. And I will admit, I am kind of stuffing probably 3 different presentations into one. So bear with me, I'm gonna go over things kind of at a higher level. But if there are any questions, we can answer them. And I think what I end up seeing a lot as a person who goes out, I meet with landowners all throughout Washington County, is people have a lot of questions about what can I do on this piece of land? What can I do on this parcel that might either be a part of the solution for climate change, even in a small way, or help keep their property resilient in light of all of these different changes that we're hearing about. And so the big stuff is super important, right? This is a global issue. We need to have these global conversations and these models and these frameworks presented. I think they're so important. And especially a lot of these models that we see on the landscape are looking at how are these species going to need to be able to move at least north and south, but potentially up and down elevations. And that points to the creation of potential corridors and land protection efforts, which we'll hear about from our next speaker. But what I'm going to try to get to today is some really boots on the ground ideas, especially for this area. I apologize for those of you who might be I know there's someone from Duluth and maybe someone from out of state. These will a little bit be more focused on like Washington County and this region, but I think you can take some of what we talk about and extrapolate it to your own area. So there's kind of two different parts, and this is very similar to kind of the resistance, the resilience. I forget the third one, Danielle. But I'm going to talk about kind of some defensive strategies. We're going to play defense for a while, and then we're going to go on the offensive and talk about some more proactive things you can do as well. Okay. So Danielle talked about this quite a bit in terms of all these changes we might see, these more severe weather events, hotter summers, warmer, wetter winters potentially, increased precipitation, all of these different changes to our ecosystems and our habitats. And that's going to end up feeling like a pretty different place if you are a woods or a tree in that woods or a mammal. What does that mean for you? And it's also potentially going to open up the door to other potentially even better adapted things to move into this area. We've seen a lot of our invasive species are pretty well adapted and have high dispersal rates to move into these areas. They're able to really take advantage of these warmer shoulder seasons that we've been having, that they can have really take advantage of that longer growing season. A lot of them can deal with these larger fluctuations that we have in terms of flooding events and drought. And so that's going to have pretty significant effects to our habitats and makes us have to kind of be on the defensive a little bit. And this is some work that was done by the Invasive Species Center. This really kind of breaks down some of the issues with invasive species that I was just talking about, but these more extreme weather events can really create opportunities. We're going to be having additional pathways for these invasive species to move in, especially when these new shipping routes open up. Different life cycles are being affected. This increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is really changing the game. I just listened to a talk, it was by Mark Renz from the UW-Madison Extension about how Canada goldenrod is, with these higher CO2 levels, they're finding grows additional root nodes and stem tissue. So it really gains a competitive advantage and also makes it much more resistant to the herbicides that in the past have been able to keep it at bay at least. And then all of these different changes to our climate, like I mentioned, those shoulder seasons and some of our invasive species really being able to take advantage of those. So these are just some of the ways that we're seeing a lot more movement and issues going into the future. And Angie knows I present some version of this graph at every talk I give because it's just kind of my soapbox, and I think it's really important. But what we're seeing here is an issue of you've got time on this x-axis and these abundance and cost of controls on the y-axis. And what we've seen is that sometimes you'll have a plant that isn't an issue in an area. Either it hasn't dispersed there, it hasn't been able to become reproductive in that area, and suddenly it wakes up. It was a sleeper before, it awakens, and it's able to then reproduce and disperse and just kind of explodes. And I'm dealing with this on a pretty personal level. In our county, we just had a new sighting a couple of years ago of a plant called the small-leafed bramble. And this was found on the Browns Creek Trail, like I said, a couple of years ago. And we started, once it was on our radar, we started reaching out to landowners about it and realizing like this is all over Stillwater Township, which is just north of Stillwater in Washington County. It's just kind of hit a tipping point, and we've been talking with landowners out there who say, you know, it was kind of here, there, and just in the last few years, we've really seen an increase in it. So we're trying to get our minds around that one. It's the only known location in Minnesota. So it's a pretty new thing. And if we can catch it, I mean, you could argue we're still early on in this graph because it's only in this pretty localized area. Hopefully we can get ahead of it before it becomes this statewide issue. So this is kind of my public service announcement. You know, try to stay on guard and learn about what invasive species might be potential in your area. And here is a tool that I would recommend for doing so. This is the early detection technique in terms of getting around early detection and rapid response efforts. You can generate a whole account and actually add to the knowledge base. It's almost like crowdsourcing for invasive species. Or you can just get on there and look at some of the distribution maps for different species and look at what might be south of you, what might be east of you, just to get to know what you should be looking for out on your property, so that when you do see it come in, you can very quickly respond, because your likelihood of success greatly increases as well. So think about using that tool. And we keep talking about invasive species as being this huge issue. And I just wanted I'll unpack that a little bit more. When we're talking about an invasive species, this is a species that is not native to this area. It hasn't been found here, it's been brought in, but it also has an element of harm to it. And it can be economic harm, it can be harm to human health, it can be ecological harm. There just has to be that harm component. And this is in contrast with, say, a hosta. Hostas aren't native to Minnesota. We've brought them in, we landscape with them. There's really no harm that they create. The invasive species, by definition, has that element of harm. And one of the things that Danielle talked about was some of these, I'll call them ecosystem services, that our forests, our native plant communities also provide. And we take these things for granted all the time. They purify our air, they filter our groundwater, they hold our soil in place. So the example that I'm showing here on top is a buckthorn infested, it's a floodplain forest. And it's not during the growing season, so you're not seeing all of the leaves and how much shade they produce, but they really shade out that ground layer vegetation, so not a lot else can grow there. And this is not great when you get these larger flooding events and these larger rain events that we've been having to hold our soils in place. So we're starting to recognize that buckthorn is in fact, a water quality issue as well as a habitat issue. And that's in contrast to this bottom picture. I'll admit they're slightly different native plant communities, but you can see this oak woodland that's not buckthorn infested, and how well that ground layer is established and really holding the soil in place. So that's just one example of these ecosystem services that invasive species can really impact. The other one that I will show you is more habitat related. And this is based on work by Doug Tallamy. He wrote this book called Bringing Nature Home. He's written a number of other books, but this is probably his most well-known. I end up recommending this book a lot, almost on every site visit. I joke that I should start to get some royalties. So if Doug ever watches this YouTube video, let's chat. Anyway, the work that he does, he's an entomologist, and he looks at the insects out in his yard. And what he did was he assessed all these different trees and how many caterpillars they support. And think about, insects and caterpillars, they're the foundation of our food web, right? If you can provide that solid foundation, you're going to be providing for all those different mammals and birds and all sorts of things to have a really healthy wildlife habitat in your property. So what he did, and I know this is a little bit harder to read, so I'll kind of walk you through it. But at the top of this list are the species of trees that had the most species of caterpillars that it supported. You can see here oaks, they're at 557. Cherries are really high on the list, willows, birches, this poplars is aspen. Then you go to the other side of the list, and probably not surprisingly is buckthorn, which supported only 10. So there's this huge difference between our native tree species and some of these invasives. Now, there is some gray area in here. There probably are, I know there are native species that are towards the bottom of this list, and there are probably non-native species that are towards the top of this list. But the take-home message is generally native species, native trees provide more of these ecosystem services like habitat than are not native ones. But I do want to point out that there is some gray too. So let's dig into a little bit on the invasive species management. This is kind of something that I could do a longer presentation on. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of the nuances of the management techniques, but I'm happy to answer specific questions if you have them later. But I'd like to provide a little bit of a framework on invasive species management and thinking about whatever species it is you're trying to manage as having a past, a present, and a future. The present is I think, fairly obvious. It's the plant that's standing in front of you that you might want to get rid of. The past is all of the potential seed that it's produced that might be kind of laying dormant in your soil, and we refer to that oftentimes as a seed bank. The future then, any seed that could potentially be produced if this plant has become reproductive. So if you can kind of think about all three of those and trying to address all three of those, past, present, and future at the same time, your likelihood of success will significantly increase. I also like to think about invasive species management based on the weed's life cycle. This is an important part of what they call integrated pest management, which is often referred to as IPM. And so we'll go into a little bit more detail on these three different life cycles, and I'll give some more woodland examples of each of those. So first life cycle strategy is an annual. Not a lot of invasives use this strategy, but some do, and I'll present one of them. Basically, you have one growing season to accomplish all the things. You have a seed, it germinates, it becomes vegetative, it then flowers, it produces seed, and it dies, all in one season. And generally, in order to manage this, you just need to make sure you're interrupting that seed set. If you can prevent that flower from producing seed, you are going to be dealing with your present, you're dealing with your future. You may have a little bit of a past, not knowing how much seed bank might be there, so you're probably going to need to revisit your site. But you have a pretty good chance of success. So I had a hard time thinking of an annual woodland invasive, but I did come across this stiltgrass. This is Japanese stiltgrass. This is what it looks like in a woodland, and you can see this distribution map. It is much more southern and eastern of us now, but there is some right at the edge, and it's actually not far away in Wisconsin as well. So it's one that for sure we need to be kind of looking for and aware of. I haven't seen it in person yet. I learned about this one just putting this presentation together, but it has this small kind of bamboo-like stalk, kind of sprawling, but it can get up to 3.5 feet tall. And really one of the things they highlighted as a pretty key identification was these silvery hairs down the length of the leaf. So if you're out and you're kind of wondering, I think it's that kind of bamboo-like vibe and that silvery hairs down the leaf that's really going to be a good indicator. And these seed heads, when produced, produce hundreds of seeds that are viable for up to 5 years. So I know I just made it sound really easy, like, oh, you just have to interrupt the seed from being produced and you're good. It sounds like this one is one of the most difficult invasive species that they're dealing with in some of these areas. Even though it is just an annual, you have to be really well timed in terms of when you do your management technique, or else it can respond and just re-establish setting seed, reflower, unless it's a really well-timed either mowing, pulling it out is probably the most effective for small populations, or an herbicide application. It really loves disturbed areas though. It has all of that seed that it sets. So whatever you do, you want to just minimize disturbance as best possible. So anyway, be on the lookout for this one. And this was my example of the annual. There's also the biennial, and this is a plant that, unlike the annual, it has 2 seasons of growth. That first season, it's a seed, germinates, and grows vegetatively. And it's really in that second season that it produces flower, it sets seed, and then it dies back. And there are, I would say, more examples of biennials that are invasives. And the one that is pretty common in our area, unfortunately, and very much fits this pattern is this garlic mustard, similar to the annual. If you can interrupt that seed set, you're dealing with your present, you're preventing any future, and you just have to think about the past and potentially that seed bank that might be present. So this is what garlic mustard looks like in the woodland. This distribution map, you can see it's a little bit more widespread than the Japanese stiltgrass. This has that white 4-petal flower. It's often, actually it probably should even be April to May is when it's producing that. It's pretty indicative that time of year. If you're seeing something 4-petaled and white that time of year, it's probably garlic mustard. There's not a ton of species in the plant world that have 4 petals. It's kind of unusual. It's pretty typical of the mustard family. So it's likely garlic mustard. It produces these really long, thin seed pods. They're called calyx. And that's what you'll notice maybe farther on in the season after it sets seed in that kind of early June timeframe. You'll start to see these long pods that eventually turn to brown that you might come across. And they have then that classic garlic scented leaf when crushed is a really great indicator. This one, again, you just want to interrupt that seed set, and you can do pulling, you can do a well-timed mow. You just want to make sure it's before that seed set. You can use herbicide. You can also prioritize. If you're seeing a plant in flower, you're going to want to deal with it. If it's not flowering, you've got a whole nother season to get to it if you do need to prioritize in that way. Also, it does produce, similar to the stiltgrass, hundreds of seeds. And those seeds, unfortunately, I've heard are viable for up to 10 years. So you're going to want to be returning to that spot for at least 10 years to make sure you're constantly depleting that seed bank. It might continue to germinate, and you've got to deal with the plants and not allow them to set seed again. And you should get control of the situation.
Tara, I've got a question here. Can you treat garlic mustard with herbicide when natives are dormant in the late fall or early spring?
Yes, a few times of year that it's best to target garlic mustard is the spring, when, you know, it's garlic mustard and this next species that I'll talk about are really two that are great examples of taking advantage of those shoulder seasons. They green up really fast. They stay green pretty late. And so those are, the best times of year to do any herbicide applications. If you're going to pull or mow, that generally needs to happen in late April, May, before that seed develops. You can still pull afterwards, but once you see those calyx kind of elongating, you're going to want to bag any material that you pull, and for sure don't mow, because you're going to be spreading that seed. You're going to make your problem a lot worse. So they'll move on to our last life cycle is the perennial. You guys are probably pretty familiar with this one. You are looking at a plant that has its first growing season. It likely will just be vegetative, but in those successive growing season, it flowers, it sets seed, it dies back, but it repeats that cycle indefinitely. With this one, obviously, you still need to interrupt that seed set to prevent your future issues, but you also need to deal with the plant itself. And these are the ones that are pretty tenacious invasives. Oftentimes may involve some use of herbicide. We're really trying to experiment with non-chemical techniques as well, and just see if we can use other strategies to try to get after these. You guys probably are familiar with buckthorn. I'll just describe it a little bit. It's this small shrub or tree. I think the really great indicator for me is this opposite leaf arrangement, or sometimes it'll even be slightly offset. We call it sub-opposite, and that's really unique to buckthorn. And what I'm presenting here is the common buckthorn. There is another type of buckthorn called the glossy buckthorn, and the management techniques are fairly similar for that as well. If there's another kind of way you can prioritize with the garlic mustard, you have kind of the 2 years, you could focus on the second year plants. If there's a way to prioritize for buckthorn, It's that you have male plants and female plants. It's only the female plants that produce the berries that you see, those really dark purple berries that hang on even into the winter. If you can prioritize and get rid of those, you're dealing with your present a little bit, but you're really prioritizing your future issue. And so then you can minimize the amount of work and seed bank that will develop into the future. There's a lot of different strategies they're trying. I would say the most traditional and kind of well established is the cut stump method, where you cut the tree, you treat the stump, or you can put a baggie over it for a non-chemical approach. And you have to deal with that. There's often underestimated how much time you need to spend in processing all of this material. It's really fun to cut them, right? But then you're like, I had to get rid of all this stuff. So think about that. You can burn it, you can chip it, you can graze it if you have small diameter stuff. Goats are becoming really popular as even an initial response to get rid of it, and then you don't have to worry about it. So think about that. And the other thing with buckthorn, I would say, is think about follow-up. I liken this plant to poking the dragon. It will respond, and at least 2 years of either mowing it down with some type of a, brush saw or contraption, or if you have a billy goat push behind. You can try burning the site if you're able to develop enough fuel on the ground that it might actually allow a fire to move through. You can bring in the goats after it's initially been removed. They're really great at dealing with all of that regrowth. You can use foliar spraying on the leaves. Like I said, buckthorn stays green. This is kind of a depressing time of year for me because you're out and you realize just how prolific it is, because it's the only thing that's still green. But it is, I would say, it's Achilles heel in a lot of ways in that way. And then I would also stress to introduce competition, to get something out there eventually that's going to cover your ground, stabilize it, and reduce the invasive potential of that spot. I know this is depressing. I'm just going to present one more perennial. We got to get the vine in there. This is Oriental Bittersweet. I wanted to present this one because it is pretty localized to our area. This is off the Department of Ag's website, but you can see these are summarizing the populations. There's 53 known spots in Washington County here, right in this kind of Stillwater area. And it's really pretty. You can see here it was planted horticulturally. Martha Stewart used it in wreaths on the cover of her magazine. There is a native one, but if it has this kind of two-tone yellow with that orange-red, it's likely the invasive. The control techniques are very similar, being a woody species, to some of the things I mentioned with buckthorn. So I just wanted to make sure, especially since this is more of a woodland talk, that this woodland vine was on your radar, because it can be pretty devastating to even well-established trees and woods. So keep your eye out for that one as well. Okay, let's get out of the defensive mode. Let's get into the offensive mode and think about, okay, what are, besides kind of holding the line and being suspicious of the plants that are growing in my woods, what are some proactive things I can do to increase resilience of my woods? And it all comes back to goals. And as Danielle mentioned, like, we can't necessarily tell you what your goals should be, but just offer guidance in trying to figure out what some of the parameters are that might help you define those. So what I'm showing here are all these letters and combinations are different native plant communities that occur in the Eastern Broadleaf Forest. The Eastern Broadleaf Forest is really a kind of band of habitat that separates a lot of the prairies that we see in the southwest part of Minnesota from the boreal forests up in the northeast. It's this transition zone. I like to think it's we get the best of all worlds. It's kind of a fun place to work because you have elements of both that kind of move in. So what they've done here is defined these native plant communities. They put them into a little packet. But what I really love about this graph is that it shows that these things occur on a whole spectrum. And the spectrum that this is showing, at least on the bottom here, you can see it goes on nutrients from poor to rich nutrients. And then On the y-axis is a spectrum of moisture. So these colors, what they represent, this yellow are a lot of our grasslands, like our prairies, our savannas, which are like grasslands that have, scattered trees, often oak trees. This orange-red blob are a lot of our oak woodlands. And this green here are more of our maple woods. And then above this dashed line are all sorts of our more wet wooded communities. These are peatlands over here. These are floodplain forests over here. So we like to put things in boxes, but I love to show people these are a spectrum. And obviously climate change might change where you fall on this spectrum. But there's lots of ways, there's lots of things your woods can be. I've been on a lot of site visits, especially lately, where we're standing in a woods and I'm looking around and there's all these really big open grown oak trees. And to me, that's a giant indicator that this was much more open in the past. These oak trees spread out and they grew, and it was likely either a grassland or maybe more like a savanna with open trees and grasses underneath. And then you look at the canopy surrounding these open grown, and it's grown up with a lot of other different oak species. Then you look at the understory, or at least maybe that subcanopy, and you're seeing a lot of maples and maybe ironwoods come in. And that's indicated more of a maple forest. So all three of these things, all three of these native plant communities are showing themselves at the same time. I think a lot of people often want me to tell them, well, which one should I pick? And it's all depends on what your goals are, often your level of effort. There's easier ones than others, what you're managing for. So I just want you to think about, there's no one right answer in how you manage these areas. So then you think about, well, what should, given this realm of climate change and things are going to be shifting, should I look south at what's going on down there and what species are down there? Should I look east or west? But often it's south, and think about moving these things up. And that idea is called assisted migration. And there's kind of a different categories of that, I guess I would say. This assisted population migration that I'm showing right here is still species that are within its historic range, but you're moving them around. And this is something that we do all the time. Like, for example, we're doing a big prairie restoration down at St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park. We need to find prairie seed. We're purchasing it and we're bringing it in. I think some of it's coming from west of us, and some's coming from a little north, and some's coming from a little south. We're moving it around from its historic range. I will say that historically, and even today, land managers have been very conservative, I guess, about doing too much of this movement. The idea is that you want to use the most locally adapted seed, the most locally adapted genetics that you can, because it'll be better adapted to your site conditions. That's how we've been trained. And there's even mandates, depending on your funding source, that say you have to use seed, or at least attempt to find seed within 30 miles of your project. That's, depending on what you're being funded with. So that's kind of where we're coming from. But now with all of these issues around climate change, we're starting to have to rethink this traditional model that maybe looking at this assisted range expansion, maybe we do need to look south of us. Maybe we do need to find those species that are wanting to make their way north just outside of our current range and start to kind of facilitate that. That's the assisted range expansion. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this assisted species migration. And these are taking species, from pretty far outside their normal boundary, outside their ability to disperse, and moving them. And there are a lot of pros and cons related with all of this. I mean, you can think about some of the challenges. Will some of these species become invasive if we move them that far? Will they hybridize with the local species and reduce their fitness? Will they bring any pests or diseases with them? Will they be successful? Are there other ways that we could do this? These are some of the challenges that we're thinking about. There's also a lot of pros to some of these approaches. And will it rescue a species or a population that might be critically at risk and doesn't have anywhere else to go because it doesn't have these natural corridors? Will it help increase our ecosystem services that we've been talking about? will it help reduce our risk from climate impacts? This is a kind of a new area, and we're still trying to figure out what makes sense in this landscape. But I would feel remiss if I didn't at least mention that this is something that to consider when you're thinking about what to plant within your woods. And this is also from the Tree Atlas. I think Danielle presented part of this as well. This has a lot going on in it, but what I want you to focus on is there's kind of two climate change models. You've got a low climate change and a high climate change model. And under that, it talks about whether or not a certain species habitat will increase or decrease, and its capabilities of dealing with the changes that are within that model. So green arrow is good, red arrow pointing down is bad. It's likely to either decrease in its habitat or its capability to thrive in those conditions, and the yellow is neutral. So what I wanted to do is provide some species that, given this area, and this is pretty focused on that eastern broadleaf forest, that might be good trees given these two different scenarios. And for wetter sites, these were the ones that jumped out at me. The basswoods, hackberry, ironwood, the maples. These are all species that, at least in both of these models, were expected to have their habitat likely increase, and also their capability of dealing with it increase. I did the same thing then for drier sites. A lot of these are oaks, but there was at least a black cherry. I felt like, all right, it's likely to have increased habitat and at least be kind of neutral in terms of its ability to deal with that. So those are some of my suggestions for species that already occur here that are likely to do well into the future. Really quick, because I think I'm running out of time. There's lots of other stewardship considerations that you can think of on your site, really to restore and maintain biodiversity. I think Danielle even mentioned it too. You're hedging your bets. You're filling your space with resiliency, because you have a lot of different traits and species and characteristics to draw on if you maintain diversity. We talked mostly about adding to the canopy, but I would also consider shrubs and ground layer as important components as well. Also, given all of these different changes to our storm events, the more you can reduce your impact to soils and increase nutrient cycling, you're gonna fare better. When you have these rain events, if you can make sure your soils aren't compacted, you'll have better infiltration. You won't have as much runoff to local water resources. So that's important. There's a lot of best management practices out there. If you're thinking about doing a harvest or editing for native plant community goals, there's a lot of ways and BMPs that are out there to help minimize your soil compaction. Leaving dead wood, the technical term is coarse woody debris. If you can leave that laying on the ground to a certain extent at least, that really helps maintain moisture retention. It's also really great habitat. Laying or standing deadwood we call snags. And if you can design your trails to reduce runoff with these large rain events, if you have just a straight shot down a hill, you're going to start to channelize your flows and increase your runoff. So if you can meander those, if you can put in water bars, just to kind of take the edge off and encourage that water to get off of that main trail and help infiltrate more in place is ideal. So it's just a few additional considerations in ways you can steward your property locally. And that is all I had for today.
Hey, Tara, I noticed that there was a number of questions coming in fast and furious while you were talking about the invasive species, not surprisingly. So just after the garlic mustard questions, which you already answered, one question about when you bag invasive species, how to properly dispose of them. And kind of going along with that, if you have buckthorn with berries, should you be bagging that instead of just leaving it lying on the ground for the berries to plant themselves?
Okay, So the dispersal or the disposal question is a great one. I know the Department of Ag is working on guidance for that very issue, and it kind of varies by species. They have these eradicate species, which are very limited in distribution. They're really targeting them to make sure that they don't become a statewide issue. Oriental Bittersweet that I presented is one of them. Those, it's illegal to move it around. If you have it and you remove it, it has to stay on your site. There's other species like buckthorn that if say a landscape company comes in and they chip it up, they can haul it away, and they don't necessarily, it doesn't have to stay on your site like that. I think ideally, the more that you can keep things on your site and deal with them there, that is preferred. But there's just some species that it's just hard to do. I would say if you are leaving it on your site, or you're required to leave it on your site, obviously burning it is going to be great to get rid of that seed. Oftentimes we'll recommend solarizing it. So put it in a pile, put black plastic over it. It'll turn into this kind of nasty goo. I would just caution about composting, because even if you're the best composter around, you may not get your compost warm enough to really kill that seed. And then you're using that compost and you're moving it around. So I would not compost if possible. Okay. I think the other question was about buckthorn berries and chipping. It probably does feel a little weird when you're out there and you're chipping up the buckthorn, and a lot of people, the landscape restoration companies, they'll chip it and they'll chip it back into the woods and put this carpet of wood chips down that is probably filled with berries as well. It's not ideal. I would say, obviously burning the berries is going to get rid of them. But I think also the recognition is that woods is going to respond. You're going to have berries in your seed bank that are going to germinate with this light that has now come in. It's a disturbance when you remove buckthorn, that you're letting in a lot more light into this area. So you're going to have to do follow-up anyways. So the more that it doesn't impact your management that significantly, if that's the easiest way to deal with it, just know that you're going to have to deal with some follow-up.
Okay. There was a couple other questions about shrubs to replace buckthorn, but I think in interest of time, I'm just going to paste some suggestions into the chat, and I will introduce Kristina Geiger from Minnesota Land Trust. For those of you who have large acreage, she can offer some really good information about permanent land protection. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Kristina.
Thanks, Angie. And my name is Kristina Geiger. I am the Associate Director of Land Protection at the Minnesota Land Trust. I'm going to share my screen. It says it's disabled. Not letting me do it.
I think I just remade you the co-host. I think it's because you had gone away and came back at the beginning. So I think you should be good to go now.
Okay. Yeah, my computer totally crashed. It was pretty crazy. So here we go. Sorry, my dog's whining too, of course, right now. Okay. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Okay. All right, here I am. And again, my name is Kristina Geiger, and I'm here to talk about, once you've done all this work on your land and you have invested your time and energy, I'm gonna go try to move my dog away. I'm so sorry. 1 minute.
Okay,
oh my gosh, the glories of Zoom presentations. Okay, so I work with the Minnesota Land Trust, and what we do is we work with private landowners and we partner with public organizations and other park conservation partners to conserve land across the state of Minnesota. So once you've put all that effort into restoring and managing your land, it might be an important thing to think about. How does it get passed on to the next generation? How is that work all protected in the long run? And so that's what the Land Trust does. We began as the Washington County Land Trust, actually, and now statewide we've protected over 70,000 acres in the state of Minnesota. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what you can do with the Land Trust. Works a lot with larger acreage holders, and by larger, you know, in the metro, I think larger is more than 20, more than 40 acres. But no matter, you know, what kind of acreage you own, you can take steps to kind of plan for the future of that land. So, you know, and these are all listed in order of, you know, least permanent, I guess, or least difficult to do, and to most. And of course, the conservation easement that the Land Trust holds is at the most protective and a little bit most involved at the very end of this list. So,
Hey,
you know, first
Kristina,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what we are seeing is just like your whole presentation, we're not seeing the slides progressing.
Oh, okay.
So we're seeing, yeah, we were seeing the cute little baby and the red. There we go, land protection tools. Now we're seeing it. Perfect.
Great. I'm glad the slide was stuck on the cute baby though.
Yep, it was stuck on a cute baby. It's okay. Everybody was
Great.
happy. And I was pasting multiple alternatives for buckthorn into the chat, so people had plenty of other things occupying their attention.
Okay, now what do you see? Land protection tools?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, so, you know, first conversations with their family, you know, what should happen to our land? Simple, right? But it can be a bigger conversation because people might have different ideas, right? Other thing is people lease out their land. They rent it, you know, agricultural acres, or maybe for timbering, or kind of other uses like hunting. So how are those leases designed? Are they long-term? Are they short-term? Do they have more kind of requirements in them for conservation, or less for conservation? And then, you know, land management agreements, how you might have contractors or people working on your land, or partnerships with neighbors, you know, those kinds of agreements that you can have. Kind of take a look at those, open those up and think about, okay, what does this mean in the long term for protecting the habitat and the forest on my land? And then of course, you know, there's other ways to transfer ownership. So, and I'm not an attorney, I'm not going to give legal advice here, but there's other ways to think about ownership, right? You can put it into a family trust. I've seen landowners do that, or an LLC, and they all have, you know, bylaws and rules about what happens and who pays for what, and that kind of thing. And then of course there's conservation tax programs. So this is a list of things that you could talk to your soil and water conservation district about, as well as your financial planner or attorney. And then, you know, more broadly, the cities and townships and counties do also work together with landowners to create zoning. For better or for worse, you know, there's zoning and there's decisions made at a community level, what they want the neighborhood to be like. And so that's something that you can get involved in as well. And then, of course, getting to the more restrictive end of things, there are restrictive covenants and deed restrictions, which is a solemn promise that basically binds the next landowners to following a set of rules. And then of course there's also sale of land, so not just protection of your private land, but there's also sale of land depending on what kinds of maybe there's public parks that you're next to or nearby, or if you really want that public access to land and that kind of conservation, that level of conservation, then that's an option if there is an entity that wants to buy it. And then finally, what the Minnesota Land Trust specializes in is conservation easements. And so that's something where the land stays private and the easement encumbers the land. And so I'll talk more about that next. All right, so conservation easements. 75% of Minnesota's landscape is privately held. You know, a lot of benefits, conservation benefits, wildlife habitat, water quality benefits, all the benefits we've been talking about tonight are on, many of them are on private land. And so it's really important to work with private landowners, because it's also something that private landowners are really great stewards of their land. So why not work with them to meet conservation goals and connect these big parklands with other big parklands and create long corridors of habitat between cores, or even create cores of habitat of private land itself. You know, not all land is fit for public ownership. It would be really expensive if we tried to buy everything. You know, who would pay our taxes? You know, so there's a lot of good benefits to having private land conserved. And so it works, it's what we talk about as a bundle of sticks. So land rights are a bundle of sticks, and you can break them apart. So you can sell your mining rights, you can sell your, you know, water rights if you're in the West. And in this case, you're selling the rights to maybe cut down your trees, and the rights to build houses, you're selling those or transferring them to another entity like the Minnesota Land Trust. And people do it, it's a big deal. And people do it because it helps them leave a legacy of conservation and to protect the land that they have raised their family on, that they inherited from their parents. And they also do it to protect a public good, right? Water quality, maybe even scenic attributes, and also the wildlife habitat that we're talking about tonight. So there's a lot of people who hold conservation easements, not just the land trust. So, you know, watershed districts, local governments, the state agencies like the Board of Water and Soil Resources, the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, and even federal agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are a breakdown of who holds easements in Minnesota. And a lot of it's state, a lot federal, and our little Minnesota Land Trust is a non-government organization. So we're in that little yellow slice. The most important thing about conservation easements is that they're perpetual, right? So at least the Minnesota Land Trust conservation easements and many land trust conservation easements across the United States, they're perpetual. And so we commit to visiting that property, watching over that property forever. And we call that conservation easement stewardship. So we make sure the easement rules are followed. And we also build partnerships with every successive landowner and making sure that that property is stewarded in the long term. We also have restoration programs so that help the landowners of protected properties manage their land. So we help them make a plan. We work with people like Tara Kelly at the Conservation District, and we write plans for these properties in partnership with a landowner. And then if they want to implement that, they can seek either technical assistance from the land trust, or even in some cases financial assistance, or a person going on there and doing it. So our current opportunities right now, we work statewide, and these blobby areas on the state of Minnesota are our focus areas. And so in the Twin Cities metro, as well as in the closer areas around, we have grant programs that help us protect land that's focused on the St. Croix River watershed and the big rivers in the metro area, Washington County's top 10 conservation priorities, and then also kind of like to the north and west of the metro, the Anoka Sand Plain. We have others as well, but kind of wanted to keep the list short to areas within the metro for folks who are on this workshop. So if you do have an interest in working with the Minnesota Land Trust, or even just want to find out more how your land might fit into kind of the land trust protection programs, you can always go to minland.org/protectland, and that link is going to be sent out to you after this as well. So we have more information online about our programs and ways to protect your land with conservation easements held by the Minnesota Land Trust there. And then these are just blob maps, you know, everybody likes a good blob map, but these are showing areas of priority for the Minnesota Land Trust. And the one on the left is the metro area. The pink areas are areas of important habitat that the state of Minnesota has identified. And then the blue lines, of course, are rivers and streams that connect to the big rivers. And because we're hosted by folks who are working within the St. Croix watershed, I wanted to share a not very great, but okay map of priority areas in the St. Croix watershed as well. So these are kind of how we identify what makes a good conservation easement project. And so we look at spatial information, how it connects to other water bodies or protected lands, as well as how big this parcel is, as well as what the habitat quality is on that parcel. And I think I'll have a list of those things coming up here. But so this is a Washington County map and shows the top 10 priority areas within Washington County. So we have a couple different ways of identifying projects, easements that would fit with our programs. So again, if you're interested in learning more, I'm happy to guide you through all these different programs we have and figure out what might be a good fit, or maybe there's a different option for you as well. Yeah, so this is a quick list of how we think about the conservation easements and what would make a good protection project, at least for the land trust. So like I said, minimum 20 acres, but we sometimes make exceptions if it was adjacent to other protected properties or it has an important rare species on the property. And we look at size, quality of natural habitat, landscape context, and we also balance the benefits against the cost of the conservation. So we do have funding to pay folks for protecting their land, and that funding's in most cases is from the Legacy Amendment, the Outdoor Heritage Fund, as recommended by the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council. So it's something that's important to us to compensate private landowners for doing the right thing. And there's a little bit more about the process, but I'll just leave you with a quote from Aldo Leopold. It says, "Conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest." So that's the goal. And I'll just leave you with a little bit of my contact information and happy to sit and answer questions along with everybody else.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristina. Are there any questions about land preservation before I introduce our last co-host and speaker? Okay. I know we are approaching 7:30. I did want to introduce Nikki Henger from the Wild Rivers Conservancy of the St. Croix and Namekagon to talk about some of the local programs that are available through that organization, specifically working with woodland landowners. So Nikki, are you here?
I am, thank you.
There you are. Okay.
Great. Can you, is it the full screen or?
Let's see. I'm not sure why I'm still seeing Kristina's screen and not yours now.
I think
There we
maybe.
go. Okay. But yes, you're right. I do only see half of your screen.
Oh, but the green box is only on half the screen for some reason. Let me do this. Does this work?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect.
Looks great.
Okay, this has been a great evening. I've learned so much. So thank you all. My name is Nikki and I am with the Wild Rivers Conservancy. We were known beforehand as the St. Croix River Association. We are a nonprofit and the official friends group of the National Park Service, the St. Croix Namekagon. Our vision is a thriving watershed, forever accessible, scenic, and wild. And I would like to add resilient to that as well. We have a forestry program to kind of help keep this area wild. We have a variety of other programs as well. So we have a K through 12 education program where we take students out onto the rivers. We have also an invasive species coordinator, but my job is to work mostly with woodland owners like yourself. So this is just a map of the St. Croix watershed. We go up north all the way to Carleton, and Washington County is the southernmost county. We work both in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And this map also shows just how forested this region is. It can be considered one of the cleanest tributaries of the Mississippi is because of how forested this landscape is. So healthy forests lead to clean water. And some of our speakers already talked about all the benefits of trees to water quality, so I won't necessarily go into that. So the My St. Croix Woods program was developed in 2017 as a partnership organization to essentially connect woodland owners like yourself to resources and professionals. The landscape of woodland stewardship can be extremely overwhelming with all the variety of different programs that there are. So this is just kind of a slide to show just how much information there are. So in Minnesota, there are tax incentive programs that can help you keep your wooded areas wooded. So there are two. There is 2C, which is essentially a reduction in property taxes. And then there is also SFIA, which is an annual tax incentive program. And both of these have different requirements. Counties also potentially have different cost share programs, and each county is different. And there is also state cost share programs. So just the Google searching, it can get a little overwhelming by saying, oh, this cost share is this county or this cost share is with this state. What are the different requirements for these different programs? If you're interested in more permanent protection, like Kristina kind of talked about, there's conservation easements or fee title acquisitions. And now you are all experts on this topic, but before this presentation, maybe you needed help figuring out who should I contact? Should I contact the Minnesota Land Trust, or should I contact Trust for Public Land? There are different nonprofits, private organization, and things like that that you may want to consider. And so essentially what the My St. Croix Woods program offers is I take a lot of phone calls, I answer a lot of emails, and I figure out what you want. And then after having that conversation, we send out either hard copy or through email a customized information packet depending on what you want. So if you're interested in wildlife, we can send you information on how to manage your woodlands for wildlife. If you're interested in those tax incentive programs that I mentioned, I could send you information that the Minnesota DNR already has, send that to you, who to contact, and things like that. We also work with foresters in the area. We work with both state and private foresters, and so we can refer you to different foresters in your area. We also offer networking opportunities, although COVID has limited this. And I'm also wearing a little bit of two hats today. So I'm on the board of the Minnesota Women's Woodland Network. And we work with women woodland owners in the area and offer networking opportunities. We have actually a hike next week, a series of hike next week with other women landowners. And so our program works with woodland associations through that. And a future goal is to also have a St. Croix woodland organization. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to email me. We also offer the annual St. Croix Forestry Conference, which is on March 24th. And this connects both natural resources professionals and woodland owners so they can network and talk about the research that is going on in the St. Croix watershed. So that's just essentially like a very brief overview of what the My St. Croix Woods program does and how Wild Rivers conserves forests in the St. Croix watershed. That is my email and my phone number if you want to call me, or if you want any type of, information packet, we can talk about that. So I know that was a very quick presentation, but I know we are close to time. So thank you.
Yeah, that's really great. And I saw one of the questions, do you work with Wisconsin too? And I know the answer is yes, which is one of the really wonderful things about bringing in Wild Rivers Conservancy, because they are able to cross state boundaries in a way that some of our other organizations cannot. So that's really great. I am going to go ahead and just share some final resources, which I will send out by email to everyone tomorrow morning. But just a final set of resources to give you a preview that you'll see. The Washington Conservation District, for anybody who does live in Washington County, is a great local resource. We do also have a tree sale every year where we sell low-cost seedlings, bundles of bare root seedlings at usually are announcing our tree sale or allowing people to begin placing orders sometime around late November to early December. So keep an eye out for that when the tree sale comes online. The My Minnesota Woods program has really great resources. Minnesota DNR has a forest stewardship program and does periodically offer cost share grants to help people do management projects on their woodlands and create woodland stewardship plans. The My St. Croix Woods that Nikki just talked about is another great resource. Minnesota Land Trust you heard about tonight. The Climate Change Resources and Field Guide for Northern Minnesota. This is one that Danielle was talking about earlier. And there is also, this is kind of a fun thing. So Minnesota DNR has this Woodlands of Minnesota, and I'm holding up a physical copy, landowner handbooks, and we ordered a whole bunch of these in preparation for this workshop. So if you have your mailing address included in the registration information, then expect to get one of these from us in the mail after the workshop. We were planning to give those out to everybody. And then just one last resource that I wanted to mention. This is kind of, if you really want to nerd out about trees, but iTree has this whole suite of tools for looking at trees, you know, kind of on a mega scale and prioritizing places for tree planting, land protection, and, you know, even being able to estimate tree canopy using aerial photography. So with that, I am going to see if we have any other questions while we still have all of our presenters here. Any last questions from folks in the crowd? We could probably stay on for another couple of minutes if you have anything you want to type in the chat, or just go ahead and unmute and ask. And if not, look for an email coming out from me tomorrow that will have a link to this recording posted on YouTube, contact information for all the presenters, and then the web links that I just shared. So. Okay. Just one last quick tip. If you do not already know this, if you go into the chat and in the upper right-hand corner, there's 3 little dots and it says more, and you go up to the top of that, save chat. That will save all of the information that was pasted into the chat, will just save onto your computer in a little text document. So I will talk slowly enough that anybody who wants to save that information from the chat can click on those three little dots right there and click save chat. Hopefully I talked slowly enough that you were able to do that. And I will go ahead and bid you adieu and hope you all have a good evening and enjoy the rest of your week, okay? Toodaloo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.